Senator Lee.
Thank you very much for being here, Mr. Buttigieg. It's a pleasure to have you. And I wanted to follow up. I want to start by following up on some questions that were asked to you by Senator Scott. Would you agree with me if I said that we've sort of overextended ourselves with regard to the Highway Trust Fund? In other words, when we created the Highway Trust Fund, the whole idea is we would impose this gasoline tax in order to create an interstate highway system. Over time, we were going to hand that system over to the states to maintain, and then we'd step back and eventually get rid of it. We haven't done it that way. We've used it to maintain the federal highway system, which is understandable. But then we've added to the list of things that we fund using the Highway Trust Fund. And we've had to dip over and over again into the general fund in order to meet our basic needs. So I believe when Senator Scott raised a similar question, your response was you'd consider anything on the table. All options should be on the table. Is that right?
Yes, I think there's a recognition that we don't have adequate national resources going into roads and highways, and that we need to look at any responsible, viable revenue mechanism we can all agree on to do something about that.
So could that include possibly increasing the gasoline tax?
Well, it's possible. Certainly many states have taken that step, including my own, but it's not the only approach.
Right. I have worried, my own state has a progressive tax, one that disproportionately affects poor Americans. Would you agree with that?
Certainly one of the concerns about the gas tax is it's likely not as progressive as federal income tax, for example.
Right, right. Not just not as progressive, but it does have a regressive impact. So in light of that, it's my view that we ought to be looking at a lot of other options before or instead of getting to that one. What about cost savings measures? Are there things you'd be willing to consider on that front?
Well, certainly something I want to look into right away if confirmed. Any government enterprise needs to run as efficiently as possible. These are taxpayer dollars, and we've got to make sure that we are streamlined in delivering as much as possible toward the actual intent. It was a focus of mine when I was mayor to make sure that we didn't have any duplicative or outdated things that were adding to the cost of delivery, and that's certainly something I want to look into here as well.
Is it also possible that some of the funding that we provide for the states for their transportation infrastructure projects could be made more efficient and more effective by reducing some of the regulatory burden that goes with them? I've heard from some state transportation officials that 20 to 30%, in some cases they insist it's more than that, of a particular project can be attributed to compliance with the federal regulations that go with the receipt of federal money. Is that something we ought to look at?
Certainly want to take a look at this. You know, again, as mayor, I saw how rules and regulations can add to the time or expense of a project. Of course, those rules are there for a reason, but if we can meet that same reason with less of a burden, we should look at how to do it.
I'd also like to talk to you about drones for a minute. Drones are becoming a very new tool and a significant driving force in our economy. Drone technology has the ability to improve the lives of every American in one way or another. There are many who are concerned about the impact that a regulatory system could have on them one way or another. There are some within the federal government who have wanted the federal government to be the actor, the enforcer, essentially the exclusive regulatory body, treating them much the same way that we treat airlines, for instance. And yet I think it's important that we look at key differences between drones and airliners. Drones in many instances are operating just feet, sometimes inches above the ground. They're much more intrusive. They have a much more direct impact on property rights because instead of dealing with tens of thousands of feet in their normal operating elevation, we're talking about feet or inches at most, a couple hundred feet. It's my view that we need to leave room for state interests. It's states that determine nuisance law. It's states that determine property rights and where someone's property rights end and begin and how they're impacted by nuisance law and things like that. Would you agree that the states have an important, prominent role to play, one that we need to make sure isn't completely preempted by the federal authority that might exist here?
I think you raise a really important point. I think up until now, most of the regulatory concern has been on the FAA side, just thinking about the fact that drones enter the national airspace. But the smaller it is and the nearer it is to the Earth, the less it has in common with those aircraft. And I recognize that that kind of safety framework for the national airspace isn't really relevant to the question of maybe a drone going a few feet up, being over a neighbor's fence, which might very well call for some kind of response, but not necessarily a federal aviation safety response.
Thank you, Senator Lee.
Thank you.